Tensions between the US and China have been steadily escalating as they spar on everything from democracy in Hong Kong to the data security of TikTok. But there's one place where a military battle between the superpowers is most likely to happen: the South China Sea. What started as a territorial dispute over rocks and reefs grew into clashes over fishing and natural resources. Now, the South China Sea is home to escalating war games between two of the world's largest militaries.
I think we're getting to a point now where confrontation is more likely.
Recent tensions have threatened to boil over.
It used to be in the old days that the Americans were clearly the superpower. They could sail where they wanted and nobody else could do anything about it. Whereas now I think the Chinese are starting to think that maybe they have the military power, the weapons that could actually threaten the Americans.
As Joe Biden comes into office, this is an issue that's not going to get any easier to solve because China sees it as part of its very core strategic interest to control that territory. That's not going to change whoever is in the White House.
We're at a kind of dangerous phase at the moment and looks set to continue.
So how did an East Asian dispute over a group of small islands become a significant flashpoint for US-China relations? The South China Sea encompasses 1.4 million square miles, making it almost 1.5 times bigger than the Mediterranean Sea. It's a key commercial gateway that sees 1/3 of the world's maritime shipping pass through it every year, accounting for more than $3 trillion in trade. Beneath the surface, the maritime life is vital to the diets and economies of the surrounding nations. Around 12% of the global fish catch comes from these waters, which also hosts more than half of the world's fishing vessels. Even further down, beneath the seabed, is the promise of natural gas and crude oil reserves. The exact amount is disputed, with both the US and China giving vastly different estimates. The US estimates that the sea holds about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil.
South China Sea, it's a strategic crossroads really. It links on one side the Pacific and the other side the Indian Ocean, and then north to China and south to Australia. Huge amounts of world trade go through, huge amounts of oil. Most of the things that we buy in the shops that come out of China, Japan, Taiwan, all travel through the South China Sea.
For decades, China and neighbouring Southeast Asian nations have disputed territorial claims within the area, largely centred around two groups of islands: the Spratly Islands in the south and the Paracel Islands in the north.
It's a point of contention because there are two kinds of disputes. There are disputes about the islands, who owns them, but they overlap with disputes about what you can do in the sea, whose rules apply, and they also overlap with this great power competition between China and the US. So it's this intersection of these three layers of disputes. That's what makes the situation so dangerous.
Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam all have claims in the region, but it's China's claims that are the most contentious. China claimed more than 80% of the South China Sea, referring to a map from 1947 that shows a U-shaped line looping down to a point about 1,100 miles or 1,800 kilometers south of its Hainan Island.
China's claim in the South China Sea emerged between 1907 and 1947, in those 40 years. And it really emerged in the context of China struggling against foreign powers in the first half of the 20th century. Against Japan, and then later against France, and then against Japan again during the Second World War. It became an emotional question. It became a time when China wanted to stand up against the world, and one way of doing that was by staking a claim to territory.
But Beijing didn't start actively asserting this claim until later in the 20th century.
It's really when oil gets discovered in certain parts of the South China Sea in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that's when it starts to heat up a bit more, and you start to see more of the islands being occupied. Philippines moves in the 70s, the Vietnamese also do the same thing, and then the Malaysians get in the game. The Chinese government doesn't make its first occupations, actually physically planting the flag in the Spratly Islands, until 1988, so they come very late to the game at that point.
In the years that followed, nations jostled among themselves for control of the islands, but since the mid-1990s, the occupation of most parts of the Spratly and Paracel Islands hadn't changed significantly. But as China's position on the world stage grew, so too did their activity in the region.
In the Chinese telling of how this spat began, China says, back in the early 2000s, China and the Southeast Asian nations who also have claims there got along fine. And what really kicked off the conflict was when, during the early days of the Obama administration, they had this pivot to Asia. And so when the US did this pivot to Asia, it sort of encouraged a lot of the Southeast Asian nations to start exerting their claims in the South China Sea, to start building on islands that they had occupied. And so then China, by Beijing's telling, felt compelled to do the same and to do it to a greater degree.
I think there have been two major changing points in recent years. So there's the 2008 financial crisis, when the American economy goes into a nosedive. You have at the same time, you have the Beijing Olympics, when China suddenly appears on the world stage. And you get a new confidence in China that maybe their way is superior to the American way of running the world. And I think that then leads into the selection of President Xi in 2012 by the Communist Party as their party leader.
China's once-in-a-decade transition of power was completed earlier today.
Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party, has just been elected president of China in a near unanimous vote.
Before Xi becomes party leader in 2012, you notice in the South China Sea different bits of the state, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the fishing protection, the police, or whatever, all following different policies. From 2013 onwards, once Xi's in power, you see much more centralized control. And that's in 2013 when you start to see China building these massive artificial islands in the Spratly Islands with huge military bases on them.
We continue our look this morning at what China does not want you to see. The United States says the superpower is reclaiming land in the South China Sea.
China has begun this campaign of building islands in the South China Sea, taking reefs and rocks and building on top of that with sand and filling in the water. And on top of that land, they've built airstrips. They've put missiles in. They've put in installments where military personnel can be there full time.
Beijing transformed the disputed reefs and rocks by reclaiming 670 acres of land from the sea to create islands with administrative buildings, hospitals, and sport complexes. There's also runways that can land fighter jets and are equipped with defensive systems, radar antennae, and radio systems, which are intended to monitor the area around them. China's use of the islands in this way prevents other countries developing resources, and that directly breaches the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as UNCLOS. UNCLOS was established in 1982, and it states that a country can have a territorial zone of 12 nautical miles off its coast, a further 12 nautical miles where it has limited controls, and an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles. China argues that the Paracel and Spratly Islands are part of its territory, and therefore they own anything within those exclusive economic zones, be it fish or natural resources, and it's been enforcing this in increasingly hostile ways.
China's general military philosophy is something called active defense, when the idea is to appear to be non-threatening and to be defensive, but to create situations where you lure the opponent into making a move which then allows you to respond in force and in full.
Enemy military aircraft, I'm warning you again. Leave immediately, or you will bear forward responsibility for all the consequences.
So what it's doing now is using these islands as a means of projecting power. So it's successfully intimidated Vietnam and stopped it developing its offshore oil and gas reserves. It's done the same thing to the Philippines. It's tried to do the same thing with Malaysia, but with less success. China, in effect, has established a kind of a block on the other countries developing their maritime resources. I suppose the next thing that might happen will be that then China might try and use its force to develop resources which it doesn't have any claim to under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that the Paracel and Spratlys were rocks rather than islands, and therefore would not get the benefits of EEZs. The ruling also stated that there was no legal basis for China's claims.
And what that meant was that suddenly the value of the disputed islands became much less in theory, because it meant you couldn't claim huge amounts of resources, oil and gas and fish from around them. However, China has refused to recognize this ruling, and the reason is obvious, is that it actually diminishes the value of these disputed islands and makes the case for the surrounding countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, much stronger for the resources, for the oil and the gas and the fish.
Diplomats in China and ASEAN countries have turned their attention to an earlier legally binding document in the hope of a resolution.
The ASEAN nations and China said to have reached an agreement to begin negotiations on a code of conduct in the South China Sea.
Unfortunately, the long-term outlook is not good. The fact is that you have a negotiation process between ASEAN and China that is not really going very well. They're trying to establish a code of conduct that would set some parameters for how business is conducted in the South China Sea. At the same time, however, they don't actually address the dispute at all. So no dispute resolution mechanisms are really being negotiated seriously at this time. What's perhaps more concerning is the ever-evolving China-US competition dynamic, which is becoming more aggressive in nature.
The US's response in the South China Sea has been mainly driven from its sort of overall strategic interests, because the South China Sea connects America's west coast from California to the Indian Ocean and to the Middle East, and so they said it's a vital strategic corridor for them, for civilian shipping but also military shipping to go through.
During the Obama administration, the issue was very contentious already. And so when Trump came in, what really happened was not that the conflict arose, but the way that the US government began to pursue its strategy became much more aggressive, became much more proactive and abrasive. That's why the situation in the South China Sea has become much more dangerous.
A US presence has been increasing in the region since 2012. Over the years, administrations have waded in on arguments over resources, but haven't taken sides in the territorial disputes until now.
Beijing doesn't respect the fundamental democratic values or those enshrined in the ASEAN Charter.
In previous years, we've seen a lot of positive language from regional partners who wish to make room for China as a global superpower. But China's come on a little hard.
The US has issued one of its strongest warnings against China over Beijing's illegal territorial claims in the South China Sea.
It's not China's maritime empire. The United States is prepared to do the things necessary to assist them in protecting their valid legal claims.
Expansion of the Chinese Navy has become one of the latest concerns for US and ASEAN nations. Beijing's anti-ship ballistic missiles are also known as carrier killers. A Department of Defense report suggests that China may be the first ever to attach this category of weapon to a warship.
There's a good reason to think that a lot of China's activities in the South China Sea in terms of building up its bases are done with a possible invasion of Taiwan in mind. They're thinking that if there was ever an invasion, an attempt to forcibly bring Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, that the United States would try and defend Taiwan. And having these islands there with missiles already on them and runways and so forth would be a way of keeping the Americans at bay. It's also, I think, part of trying to create a bastion, a hiding place for their ballistic missile submarines there, and a way of just keeping the Americans away from their southern coast. Both China and the US regard the South China Sea as pretty crucial to their overall strategic interests, which means they're going to struggle hard.
The escalation of military activities in the South China Sea, even in the midst of a pandemic, has many onlookers concerned. A war of words on Twitter and state TV has transformed into warships and military drills that could be the start of a new Cold War.
In the final waning days of the Trump administration, you've seen a slew of measures taken. And I think a lot of those measures have been taken to try and prevent Joe Biden's administration from coming in and undoing a lot of what President Trump had put into place during his time in office. Based on what we've heard from the Biden administration, it does seem that the strategy will be to work more closely with allies. If the Biden administration is able to form a united front as it comes to the South China Sea, I think two things could happen. If it becomes an alliance against China, I think you will see the Chinese become more aggressive in pushing back on that. The alternative would be some sort of more inclusive alliance that wants to welcome China into the fold. And if that is something that happens, I think you can see a much more benign resolution to the problem. Obviously, there are a lot of things going on in the United States. I don't think the South China Sea is particularly high on Joe Biden's priority list at the moment. But I think in the future, in the next couple of years, that is what will start to develop.
The U.S. is grappling with the global microchip shortage, and at the center of the crisis, Taiwan, home to the world's biggest chip maker. China's debt-trapped real estate developer is back in the spotlight. Evergrande's chairman sold his shares to save the company, while another shareholder sold to save himself. Beijing takes new action in its clampdown on Chinese internet giants. This time, it's targeting China's version of Facebook. The Chinese Communist Party is covering up again. Photos and videos about Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai were made public outside China, but in China, they are censored. A Seattle man returns home after being held hostage in China for 4 years. Alongside his return, the U.S. released 7 prisoners back to China. And in the waters surrounding Taiwan and Japan, 5 countries are holding a joint military drill. They are looking to counter Beijing's aggression there.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Nations around the world are struggling as the global microchip shortage persists. And the United States is stuck in the middle. On one hand, it's looking to boost domestic chip making. On the other, it's strengthening ties with Taiwan, home to the world's biggest chip manufacturer. Here's more.
Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, is the world's largest contract microchip maker. It's responsible for producing almost all of the world's most sophisticated chips, as well as many less advanced versions. These chips keep computers, cars, and smartphones around the world running. Because its tech is so widespread, any interference in TSMC's production process can spell major trouble for the U.S. and other nations. Many see the company as a kind of bridge connecting the safety of Taiwan and safety of the American supply chain. And that's exactly what's happening now. Talks between the U.S. and Taiwan earlier this week focused on the globe's worsening chip shortage. The event was dubbed the Second U.S.-Taiwan Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue. It marks the latest U.S. effort to strengthen economic ties with the chip-making powerhouse. There, U.S. Undersecretary of State Jose Fernandez and Taiwan's Economy Minister Wang Meihua discussed how to ease chip shortages and respond to what they called China's economic coercion. That comment came in response to recent remarks from Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping, warning that U.S.-based Taiwan supporters were, quote, playing with fire. China's communist regime has never ruled Taiwan, but has long claimed the island as its own territory. Beijing has repeatedly hinted at taking over Taiwan by force. At the meeting, Wang said Taiwan and the U.S. are aiming for a long-term goal. For decades, Asian countries have replaced the U.S. as the world's top chip manufacturers. But the trend may be shifting. TSMC is now building a $12 billion plant to ramp up production in the U.S., while Korean giant Samsung is set to build a factory in Texas to the tune of $17 billion. It remains to be seen how the U.S. will balance its relationship with Taiwan and its efforts to boost domestic chip making.
Outside the tech industry, the U.S. is fostering its relations with Taiwan in other areas, too. 5 U.S. Congress members arrived in Taiwan on Thursday. Talks between them and Taiwan officials are expected to focus on security matters. Their short visit marks the second time in a month that American lawmakers have visited the island. Prior to arriving in Taiwan, the 5 politicians had made stops in Japan and South Korea. Good and bad news for debt-trapped real estate company Evergrande. 2 big shareholders are selling their shares. One is aiming to save the company, and the other is trying to keep a distance from it. On Thursday, founder and chairman of Evergrande, Hua Kai-yen, sold a large amount of his shares, raising over $300 million for his company. The share sale reduced Hua's stake in Evergrande by about 10%, but he is still the biggest shareholder. Evergrande reported over $300 billion in liabilities, and it has been selling assets to make payments. And Chinese authorities told Hui to help pay bondholders with his personal assets. The company's shares have fallen over 83% from last year. A real estate company in Hong Kong, Chinese Estates Holdings Limited, announced Wednesday that it would sell all of its Evergrande shares. That's over 700 million shares. It's estimated to be worth less than $300 million. As Evergrande shares already fell by more than 80%, the Hong Kong company will suffer a loss of about $1.3 billion. Chinese authorities are also trying to reduce the crisis. A government body took over an Evergrande soccer stadium under construction. It would be the world's largest soccer venue if it were to be completed by the end of 2022 as originally planned. Beijing's clampdown on the technology sector now has a new target, Wechat. This messaging app is the most popular social media platform in China, with more than 1 billion active monthly users worldwide. It's called the Facebook of China.
The clampdown on Wechat takes a different form than it's taken for other Chinese technology giants. This time, the Chinese Communist Party ordered at least 9 state-run companies to restrict their employees' use of the app. And the reason? They were citing security concerns about data. Most state-run companies in China are large-scale. These 9 companies include some of the biggest. Among them, China National Petroleum had more than 1 million employees. China Mobile has 447,000. and China Construction Bank about 350,000. Employees at these companies were told to close or delete work-related chat groups due to sensitive information they may contain. The journal also reported that Chinese app stores got a notice from the country's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. The Wednesday notice says WeChat parent company Tencent could only update its apps or launch new apps with government approval. This is not the first time Tencent has been caught in Beijing's clampdown. As an online video gaming giant, Tencent was hit hard by the new strict restrictions on online gaming time. And in summer, Chinese regulators blocked Tencent's effort to merge two major game streaming sites. Since last year, the impact of internet giants on society is triggering increasingly more alarm from Beijing. WeChat users can not only chat with each other on the platform, as with Facebook, but also do many other things, such as paying bills and hailing taxis. The authorities also use its popularity to carry out certain services, like contact tracing. This is part of their so-called health code system, in this app installed on citizens' mobile phones. The same is true for citizens' vaccination records. Companies such as Tencent now have hold of an unimaginably large amount of data, and they are in the way of the communist regime, seeking to solely control such information.
To boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics or not? More countries are considering the question now, 10 weeks ahead of the opening ceremony. That includes the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. They cite human rights violations in China and the unfolding events involving China's tennis star Peng Shuai, who accused a Chinese high-ranking official of sexual assault. And Lithuania joined the list this week. The small European country is seeking to coordinate with the US and the European Union on a boycott. Its sports minister already said on Thursday she will not attend the games. And what in their minds is a diplomatic boycott? It means diplomats wouldn't go, but athletes would. This seems to be a light version of not sending athletes to the games. However, it would still have an effect. German sports policy expert Jürgen Mittag told German broadcaster Deutsche Welle that the absence of a large number of country heads would damage the Olympics, and Beijing wouldn't achieve what it hoped for, a good image. He added other countries will think carefully about the boycott because China is a global power and could retaliate in other ways. Now we look to Beijing's hostage diplomacy. A Seattle resident finally returned home after being held hostage in China for 4 years. The man's name is Daniel Xu. He says he found out he could leave China 4 days before Biden's meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. While Beijing allowed Xu to come back to America, the U.S. also released 7 prisoners back to China. These prisoners include a former Chinese bank executive who's on Beijing's wanted list and 2 women who were arrested after they entered Trump's mansion in Mar-a-Lago in 2019. Another 2 prisoners were convicted of taking photos of a naval air station in Florida, and another 2 committed financial crimes in Utah. As for the Seattle man, Daniel Xu, he didn't commit any crime. Beijing held him hostage because it wants his father to return to China. Chinese authorities say his father embezzled over $60,000. Xu's father denies the charge. It's been days since Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai has resurfaced. Before that, she was out of the public eye for 2 weeks after she alleged on social media that a prominent Chinese official had sexually assaulted her. But as the world continues to wonder just what is happening with the 3-time Olympian, China is working hard to keep coverage of the story out of its news within its borders. Will Ripley has more.
When China's communist rulers don't like the message,
this broadcast is not being aired in China. It's being censored.
They silence the messenger. They have an army of censors waiting to push that button.
They don't want the people there to see it.
CNN coverage of tennis star Peng Shuai blocked inside China.
It really tries to control the story, control the narrative.
Controlling the narrative means scrubbing social media. Peng's explosive post on November 2nd, accusing a retired Chinese leader of sexual assault, erased within 30 minutes. Look for the story on China's leading search engine. You get this message. Sorry, no relevant results found. The scandal, so politically sensitive, a high-profile state propagandist referred to it on Twitter as the thing people talked about. Inside China, state media staying silent. No mention in the mainland's TV or digital media. Outside, those news outlets eagerly tweeting updates and images of Peng in English on a platform blocked in their own country. An irony not lost on millions following the story outside China, some even mocking the state media tweets. Peng is seen smiling, but not talking, at a tennis tournament, having dinner with friends, and a Chinese sports official who just so happens to mention the exact date several times. CNN has no way to independently verify these videos or this email, supposedly from Peng, to the head of the Women's Tennis Association last week, claiming everything is fine. A computer cursor visible in this apparent screenshot. The head of the WTA telling Outfront he's not convinced.
I'm just struggling to agree to that and don't believe that's the truth at all.
The WTA demanding direct, uncensored communication with Peng. The organization's repeated calls and messages to the tennis star unanswered.
China is well known for coercing statements to show that everything is fine.
China's narrative bolstered by the International Olympic Committee. The IOC handed out this single image of a video call Sunday, along with a statement summarizing the call, claiming Peng is safe and well, totally ignoring her painfully detailed allegation of sexual assault. With billions of dollars in ad revenue on the line, critics call the IOC complicit in China's apparent silencing of a three-time Olympian, who many fear is being held under duress, censored by China's authoritarian government, which blames hostile forces for politicizing the issue. When CNN goes to the next story, our signal returns. As China waits for the news cycle to move on, the pressure keeps growing. The world keeps demanding answers.
A Chinese human rights lawyer traveled to Shanghai to get the U.S. counsel to help his client. But right after he got off the train, he found himself surrounded by a group of unidentified people. NTD's Juliet Song has more.
A Chinese human rights lawyer was briefly detained after he tried to seek help from the U.S. consulate in Shanghai. Xie Yang had been reaching out to help his client, who's being held in a Chinese jail as her health quickly deteriorates. His client's name is Zhang Zhan. She's a citizen journalist who went to Wuhan to report on the pandemic. Authorities later detained her and sentenced her to 4 years in jail over her reporting. Zhang has since taken up a hunger strike in jail, and her health is getting worse.
According to multiple reports citing her relatives' comments, Ms. Zhang is near death.
In a Twitter post earlier this week, Zhang's lawyer Xie Yang said he was going to talk to the U.S. consul in Shanghai about Zhang's situation. He also tagged a train ticket in his post. In a later tweet, Xie says he was detained by a group of unidentified people after he got off the train in Shanghai. Authorities held him for a short time before sending him back to his hometown, accompanied by police officers.
Beijing is limiting a citizen's personal freedom, and limiting someone's freedom like that is a human rights violation.
Xie has encountered similar experiences before. Earlier this month, he tried to visit Shanghai to meet with Zhang Zhan's family, but authorities stopped him in the name of pandemic prevention measures. Juliet Song, NTD News.
The United Nations is urging China to free citizen journalist Zhang Zhan. The organization is making the call on humanitarian grounds. They are calling on China to make urgent life-saving medical care available to her. 2 new CCP virus cases are raising alarm in Hong Kong. The cases are caused by a new variant of the virus, first detected in South Africa. The World Health Organization says the new variant is highly transmissible, and researchers are now trying to find out if this variant is vaccine resistant. One of the men infected with the virus just came back from Africa. Hong Kong quickly tightened its border control. Starting Saturday, non-residents who have been to certain states in southern Africa are banned from entering the city. Britain and the European Union states also imposed stricter border controls in response to the new variant. The South China Sea isn't the only body of water China's disputing territorially. The East China Sea also has its share of controversy. And to counter the communist regime's military threat, 5 countries are conducting drills in the region.
5 nations are conducting joint Navy drills in waters close to Taiwan and Japan. Navies from the U.S., Japan, Canada, Australia, and Germany are engaging in various types of drills in the East China Sea and the Philippine Sea, including air and anti-submarine warfare operations. For the first time ever, the German Navy joined these drills. And Germany also recently increased its presence in the Indo-Pacific region. Earlier this year, the German Navy announced a regular deployment to the region. And next year, Germany says it will send fighters, tankers, and transport aircraft to the region as well. On Thursday, Japan's self-defense forces and the U.S. Marines conducted a joint exercise in Tanegashima Island in southwest Japan. It aimed to strengthen their capabilities in combat on land, sea, and air, as well as coordination between allies. This to counter Beijing's assertiveness around the disputed islands Senkaku or Diaoyu in the East China Sea. In the area around the Strait of Malacca, a maritime training activity is underway. Earlier this week, Malaysia and the U.S. kicked off 8 days of training. That area connects the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, and it's one of the most important shipping lanes in the world.
Now we look to Japan, one of the United States' most important allies in East Asia. Japan is getting more actively involved with its allies and neighbors in trade and military operations. Their efforts have one thing in common: countering the growing threats from Communist China.
The U.S. is building stronger ties with Japan to counter China's influence. The U.S., the European Union, and Japan have agreed to renew a trilateral partnership. The alliance will address challenges from other countries' non-market policies. The announcement comes days after U.S. President Joe Biden met virtually with Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping. There was no specific mention of countries with non-market policies, but Bloomberg cites U.S. officials as saying the Biden administration clearly has concern about China's non-market economic practices. To counter this threat, Japan is one of the U.S.'s most important allies in Asia. Japan is a democracy, and it's one of the most technologically advanced nations in Asia. It's also the largest economy in the region, and the third worldwide. After China and the U.S., Japan has a gross domestic product, or GDP, of over $5 trillion. Japan's population is close to 40% of that of the United States, even though it looks much smaller on a map. In response to China's increased military presence in the Asia-Pacific region, Japan increased its national defense budget to new highs. Outlet Nikkei Asia says the country just approved over $6 billion in additional funding for defense. Japanese officials told the Wall Street Journal the money will be used to defend the island chain from southern Japan to Taiwan. After being defeated in World War II, Japan has limited its military budget within 1% of the country's GDP. Though the limit was removed in late 1980s, its impact still exists. But amid concerns about China's military presence in the East China Sea, Japan's ruling party made a pledge to double its defense spending. Japan will use those funds to build an indigenous stealth fighter and missiles able to travel over 500 miles. The rest of the money will go towards strengthening its cyber, space, and electromagnetic warfare capabilities. Since October, Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force joined several drills in the South China Sea and in waters close to Japan and Taiwan. The drills were operated by the U.S. and other democratic countries, seeking to demonstrate their presence in the region. Safety conditions in the region are directly tied to Japan's territorial dispute with China. According to Japanese media, 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships entered waters around the Senkaku Islands earlier this month. In response, Japan's top government spokesman accused China of violating international law, adding that Japan cannot accept it. The Senkaku Islands are a group of islands in the East China Sea. China knows them as the Diaoyu Islands instead, and Beijing insists they're part of Chinese territory. But Japan controls the area and denies Beijing's claim to them. Despite the tensions and the communist regime's propaganda campaigns against Japan, the two nations' close geography ensures close economic ties between them. Data shows China has become Japan's #1 export buyer, having consumed more than 20% of Japanese exports last year. It's the first time China has passed the U.S. to become Japan's top export consumer.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.